So today's tutorial is very, very highly anticipated. This is a lovely watercolour peony tutorial, and I want to let you know that I work quite quickly in this tutorial and I use a lot of brush strokes. So I refer to brush strokes a lot. And if you don't know what I'm talking about and you don't know what a C-curve brush stroke is, I recommend that you go back and watch my brush strokes tutorial, which I will link here for you. Watch that first, familiarize yourself, and maybe even have a bit of practice before you jump into this peony tutorial. But if you're feeling confident, jump in straight away and give it a crack. So let's get started. Alright, I'm getting started with a size 8 round brush, and I'm going to be using a really beautiful deep reddish pink, and I'm getting heaps of that paint on my brush, and I'm adding a little bit more water on my brush as well to make sure it's lovely and wet. So I'm using a fair bit of paint and water on my brush for this, and I'm starting off with some simple C-curve brush strokes, and I'm working really loosely and messily, doing lots of very loose C-curves to create some petals that are kind of around the middle of my peony. And I'm adding in some more C-curves, working quite quickly and loosely, and adding in some little dots as well to allude to the actual center of the peony. And you'll notice a lot of white space between these first petals and the cluster of dots. That's to really just allude to the petals rather than actually painting anything particularly realistic. So I'm using lots of white space today between petals, not necessarily completely white between each petal, but just enough to give you the idea of the shape of the petal. So I'm adding in another layer of petals made up of lots of C-curves. As I said before, working really messily and quite quickly, because the more imperfect and messy, the better I find when I'm painting these loose flowers. So I'm grabbing more paint on my brush, making sure it's lovely and concentrated, but I'm also working in a way that some of my petals are, I guess the paint is a bit more diluted than others as well. So I'm adding some more C-curves around the outside of the peony to, I guess, kind of encase the other petals, and they're a bit thinner, these petals, which gives the illusion, not the illusion, but the impression of looking at the petal on the side to give a more three-dimensional look to the flower. And now I'm adding some more petals that are sort of falling down from the bottom of the flower, because this is a really beautiful, very open peony flower. So it's been opening over a few days, that kind of thing. So it's a very lovely, open, sort of floppy looking peony, really, really fluffy. And so I'm just adding some more of those petals flopping down from the bottom of the flower. So lots of C-curves there. And again, lots of white space between these petals as well. Chucking in a couple more petals underneath just to fill in some space, and dabbing in a little bit more dark paint just around the tips of some of the petals to add some depth and variety too. So just dabbing that in with the concentrated paint. And now I'm going to dab in a little bit of orange in the center of the flower to kind of allude to the stamen of the flower. And you'll see that I'm working quite quickly, so the flower is still really wet, so I'm using the wet on wet technique for this. So as I said, I'm working really fast today, so feel free to watch this video a couple of times and also refer back to my brush strokes video and my wet on wet techniques video if you're not sure what the heck I'm talking about. Okay, so now I'm going to be painting another peony flower, but it really hasn't opened up quite yet, so it's still kind of in a bud phase, if that makes sense. And I'm doing these two C-curves mirroring each other as I did earlier, and adding in another C-curve and some white space there. So you'll see that I've left a bit of white space to allude to the fact that there's more than one petal there, and it's just gradually opening up just a little tiny bit. So I'm using lots of C-curves over and over again for this flower. And I was actually using a real peony flower for my reference to, I guess, give the idea of the shape of the flowers, the shape of the buds, and I guess the directions that the petals were sitting and all that sort of thing. So it's really helpful to have a picture to work from, or a real flower in person if you do have access to them. So I've got some more paint on my brush and I'm going to get started painting another peony flower similar to the first one that I painted, but sitting a little bit further below it and facing a different direction. I'm actually moving down to my size 4 round brush, so I'm using a slightly smaller brush for this flower, but I'm following the same techniques as before, so just on a slightly smaller scale. So I'm painting my leaves using the C-curve techniques. So I'm painting my petals using the same C-curve techniques that I did before. Alright, so I'm going to be dabbing in some more orangey red and I'm adding in some little dots to create the effect of the stamen of this second peony flower. So you will see again that I've used lots of really loose fluffy brush strokes and quite diluted paint for a lot of this second peony, just to create the impression of the flower rather than painting every single petal. And now I'm grabbing some green that I actually have mixed up in the lid of my tray to create the stems and leaves of these flowers. So I'm going to use just the very tip of the brush, the very tip of the brush, to paint a really thin curved line with this green, and it's quite diluted, the green, and I'm going to use some brush strokes that I'll link to my leaf brush stroke video for you so that you can see in detail how to paint these leaves. But I'm using the tip of the brush, the belly of the brush, and the tip of the brush again to create that leaf shape with my brush, and dabbing in a little bit of concentrated paint just to add a bit of depth and detail for that second leaf as well. And now I'm adding in a stem, which I've actually let the stem sort of tap the leaf. No, I've let the stem tap the petal of the peony. Oh my gosh, I can't even talk. But you saw what happened. My brush, which had green paint on it, tapped the pink paint, and the green paint sort of bled into those pink petals, which is absolutely fine. And I did know that was going to happen if the brush did tap the petal, but I just need you to be aware of that. If you don't want the paint to bleed and you're looking for more crisp lines with it without the green flowing into the pink, make sure that your flowers are completely dry before adding in any stems or leaves, because otherwise you do run the risk of that happening if you accidentally let your brush tap the wet pink paint. So I'm popping in a few more leaves and dabbing in a little bit more concentrated paint on that leaf, and here we have 3 beautiful, bright, whimsical peonies painted in a really lovely loose style, which is really cool and very unique to watercolor. So if you enjoyed this tutorial, make sure that you subscribe to Ruby Tuesday Art on YouTube so you don't miss my weekly tutorials. They come out on Tuesday, of course, because Ruby Tuesday. So make sure you subscribe, and also check a comment on this video if you enjoyed it, and if you have any requests for future tutorials as well.